My dad was and still is my hero. I'm sure it sounds just like another worn-out cliché, and hell, it might be. But it is very important to me that you remember this piece of information because, otherwise, all the things that I'm going to tell you about, all the actions I've taken, will make me seem like a total lunatic. He was an anthropologist by trade, and you could tell from the moment you met him. Even as young as I was, I knew that my dad loved people. He was fascinated by them, and he adored everything about them. It was woven into the dorky Hawaiian dad shirts he wore when he threw spontaneous backyard barbecues, tucked into his palm as he enthusiastically shook hands with every barista and bank teller he met, and etched into the crinkles of his eyes as he let out another boisterous laugh, the sort of laugh that made everyone else in the area want to laugh with him. People, it seems, loved him too. He wrote a lot of books, and apparently his personality shone even in writing, because they sold incredibly well. It was after the smashing success of one book in particular, one discussing folk legends in our home state of Colorado, that he decided we would buy the vacation home. God, it seems bitterly ironic looking back on it now, but we'll get to that. The vacation home was in a tiny Welsh town called Arfordir. It was, as the Welsh name suggests, on the sea, and the town lined a semicircular divot in the country's coastline, flanked on either side by craggy cliffs. Only a short distance out from the beach, approximately where the center of the circle would be if it were completed, there was a tiny island. It was scarcely more than a large rock, harboring little besides a couple of small grottos and a smattering of gulls' nests. It was called Morgan's Isle. I only ever got to spend a couple of summers at the house, but I remember those summers very fondly. My dad was deeply interested in the area, not only because of his appreciation for Welsh culture, or what little remained after the gentrification of the area, but also because of some of the town's more unique attractions. Two in particular stand out to me as I reflect on it, and both involved the island. If you were outside at night, or when a dense fog had blanketed the town, you could hear a low, haunting melody rolling in off the sea. It was like someone playing the flute, resonant and mournful, far away across the water. My dad always thought it was the wind, catching in the cracks and crevices of Morgan's Isle and flowing back out across the water, friction from the sea-soaked rocks producing the ghostly howl. During the day, he said, the sounds of the town drowned it out. But at night, we would sit together on the back porch of the house and listen to the island sing across the inky sea. From our porch, it was also possible to observe the other phenomenon. If you looked out towards the island on a clear night, it was possible to see small, glittering points of light drifting over the dark water. They typically appeared in pairs, and they seemed to dip and swell as if riding atop the waves. My dad thought that it was a trick of the moonlight, perhaps an unusual reflection from something on the island or the shore. And he thought they were beautiful, like diamonds drifting on the sea, he said. And I looked up at him, stars in my eyes, and agreed. I was only 9 when he disappeared. He had decided that he was going to go fishing for the day. We had a small boat, and he went out on it pretty frequently, leaving in the mid-morning, not returning until the last dregs of sunlight were slipping from the sky. Usually he would let me come with, and I begged to go that day too, but he wouldn't let me. I'm still not sure why. Maybe I had been particularly clingy for the days preceding, or maybe he was planning to go out and do something dangerous that morning. I don't know. But I do know that, as darkness fell that evening, he didn't come back. And he never did again. They found the boat, bashed up against the cliffs a few miles down the coast from Arfadir. But no sign of Dad. While accidents like this were uncommon in the area, they were not unheard of, and it was ultimately written off as an accidental drowning. They trawled the area for a while, looking for his body, but nothing turned up, and after the worst plane ride of our lives, my mom and I had to bury an empty casket. We didn't go back to the vacation home after that. We were all right financially, as my dad had left us a sizable chunk of savings to supplement my mom's income. But we couldn't face going back to where it all had happened. At the same time, though, my mom couldn't bear to get rid of the place. And so it sat, falling into disrepair, for 11 years. Until a few days ago. I recently turned 20, and after having something of an early life crisis, I decided it was time to get some closure. My mom was not a big fan of my decision. If it was up to her, we would just let the house rot to nothing and never think about it again. But I had made up my mind. And before she could mount any real effort to stop me, I was bound to Cardiff Airport. I opted to check into Arfadir's small inns rather than attempting to stay at the house. This turned out to be a smart decision, as when I arrived at our old vacation home, it was in a state of severe disrepair. Being so close to the sea, weathering had taken its toll on the home's exterior, and the once well-kept garden had turned into a tangle of unkempt grass and thorny weeds. The interior was largely preserved, save for one room which had flooded through a hole in the roof, but a thick layer of dust had settled over what little furnishings had remained when we'd vacated the place. Evening was fast approaching, and I decided that it would be best if I returned to the inn to decide what to do with the place. As I was pushing through the door, I turned back one last time, half expecting to see my dad sitting on the stairs behind me. But no one was there. After a restless night, I decided to spend the next day, yesterday, out on the water. I bought some supplies from a dingy little tackle shop and slid into a rented boat in the harbor. As I chugged out into the sea, I had this eerie feeling that I was reliving my dad's last day. Peering across the glittering waves, my eyes snagged on a narrow cave, tucked into the jagged flank of Morgan's Isle. I started steering towards it for a moment, but stopped myself. What was I doing? I'd seen people try to approach the cave before, and a patrol boat would always stop you, saying that it wasn't safe for public access. Liable to collapse, they'd say. A tiny part of my brain whispered that they probably hadn't checked there all those years ago. They would have thought it was too dangerous, not worth the risk of searching. Maybe. Just maybe. No, I shook my head, as if to knock the idiotic thoughts out of my brain. I was there to get closure, not open some silly, dangerous, and likely fruitless investigation. I found myself a good spot a little ways past the island instead, and settled in for a day of fishing. I didn't end up catching anything. We had never caught much when I was younger anyway, and the years in between had taken their toll on the already dwindling fish population. Besides, I could never quite completely wipe the thoughts of the cave from my mind. Before I knew it, the long, uneasy afternoon had slipped away into the evening, and darkness spread quickly across the sky like a stain. As I rounded the island, I could see no other silhouettes against the shimmering lights of the town. I was alone, on the water, was so close to the cave. I dragged my palms down my face. I knew I wouldn't get a wink of sleep if I didn't at least check, and, besides, now was the perfect opportunity, with no patrol boats crawling around. Hidden by the darkness of the open sea, I anchored the boat as close as I could to the tiny, rocky beach at the cave's mouth and splashed my way to the entrance, wincing as the icy water soaked into my sneakers. Standing on the gravel beach, I fumbled in my pocket. I was relieved to feel the clink of my keyring against my fingertips. Pulling it out, I pressed the button on the small flashlight that I kept clipped to the ring, and its weak beam cut through the darkness ahead of me. The small comfort that the light afforded me was dashed as I heard scuffling from behind some large stones just a few feet ahead. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight toward the source of the sound, and I stumbled back as a figure moved from behind the rocks. "Dad?" It had come out as a question, but as my disbelieving eyes flickered over the man in front of me, I was sure it was him. He was much older and far scruffier than he was when I'd last seen him, and he was still somewhat obscured by the shadows of the cave's entrance. Still, I felt certain it was my dad. My heart leapt in elation, and I stumbled forward, slipping on the loose, wet gravel in my haste to embrace him. To my dismay, however, he started backwards, jerking out of the way of my open arms and slipping backwards, further into the cave. "There's no time, Carter." His voice was rough and strangled with disuse. "What?" He jerked his head backwards, indicating for me to follow him into the cave. I was so stunned by the strangeness of the interaction, by his sudden appearance and by his form retreating further into the darkness of the cave, that I followed without question. At that moment, it seemed like the only thing I could do. While his strides seemed quick and practiced, mine were rendered unsteady by the slick rock beneath me. He was still just ahead of me, just on the edge of my flashlight beam, but I had to pick up my halted, slippery pace to keep up with him as he continued to press on. "There's no time for reunions yet. I promise you. All of that will come in due time, but for now, I just need you to trust me." I was out of breath from our rapid pace, and though questions burned at the tip of my tongue, I wasn't able to vocalize them. The walls of the cave seemed slightly closer now, and my claustrophobia built into a lump in my throat, further blocking any attempt at communication I might make. "Years ago, the day I disappeared, I discovered a ritual site in the back of this cave," he explained, and I staggered onward. "I don't remember what happened between then and 2 days ago. All I know is that I woke up here, with the ritual site glowing around me. I managed to find out the date from a passing boat. I don't know what happened, Carter. And I'm so sorry for leaving you for so long. But I do know that something is happening tonight, in this cave. I don't know what will happen if we don't stop it, but I don't want to find out, and I need your help." My head was spinning with all the new information. He was still moving quickly in front of me, and stunned as I was, I lost my focus for a moment, and with it, my footing. My toe caught the small edge on the ground beneath me, and I tripped, halting for a moment as I caught myself on my hands, scraping myself badly. However, it was not the pain that I noticed. The moment I had stopped, so had my dad. I stood, slowly, and took another step forward. So did he. I took a few more, and he followed. But each time I stopped, he would too. It was as though he was determined to stay exactly as far from me as he was currently, just close enough to still be visible, just far enough to avoid the full power of my feeble flashlight beam. My blood ran cold.
"Carter, come on,"
he said gruffly, urgency and something else that I now know to have been hunger, distorting his tone.
"We have to hurry."
That had been the point all along, hadn't it? To hurry me along, feed me lots of information all at once, give me no time to think. But now I was thinking. It was a plausible story, sure. My dad had been a curious man, and if he had seen the same opportunity I had, it was certainly possible that he would have tried to explore the cave as well. An anthropologist would have been intrigued by a perceived ritual site. And if something supernatural had indeed happened, it could explain his disappearance in the manner that he had described. But something still bugged me. As I mentioned, my dad had always loved people. Now, the first person he's seen in 11 years, even if those 11 years were a timeless blur, arrives at the cave and he spends no time greeting them, not even when that person is his own son. It didn't seem right. I tensed my hand around my keychain and in one smooth motion, moved forward and focused the pale beam right on the figure in front of me. He jolted backward as quickly as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. Not this time. And I finally saw him for what he was. Sure, he looked a lot like my dad, an aged-up, banged-up version of him, tailor-made as if he'd been unconscious in a cave for 11 years. An excellent copy. But I could also see why he'd been avoiding the light. In the detail afforded by the dim light, I could see the way his limbs seemed slightly too long, the way his shoulders didn't quite slot in their sockets, the way his teeth seemed just a bit too large for his mouth, and his eyes, Christ, they were the same color as my dad's, sure, but that's where the resemblance ended. They were empty, glassy, artificial, like the false eyes they stick in taxidermied animals, a poor imitation of the real thing. My dad was an anthropologist, and I know a person when I see one. This wasn't. The next few minutes are a blur in my memory. I remember sprinting back in the direction I'd come, slipping and sliding in the algae-coated stone beneath me. I could hear him chasing me, and worse, I could hear more of them behind him, scampering through the cave on what sounded to me like wet, slippery, clawed hands and feet. As I ran, I kicked rocks backwards, hoping they would slow their progress. I guess it must have worked, because the next thing I knew, I had flung myself into my boat and gunned it away from the island, not even bothering to look back and see how close an escape it had been. This brings me to today. As you might expect, I didn't sleep a wink. I spent the whole night researching, trying to figure out exactly what it was that happened to me. From what I've put together, it is likely that the first part of the story I told was true. My dad probably did see the cave, seek the opportunity to explore it under the cover of darkness, and venture deep into it, hoping to discover a hidden anthropological treasure. But I don't think he found anything human in that horrible place. And I am certain now, even more than I was, that he is dead. Do you know where the name Morgan's Isle comes from? I certainly didn't. Before my midnight research session, I'd always assumed that it was just named after an important figure in the area, like Jacksonville or Pennsylvania in the US. It turns out, though, that this is not the case. I doubt that many of the current residents of Aphrodite would pick up on the name's significance. Hardly any of them are Welsh, and fewer are old enough or rooted enough in the area to remember any of the legends attached to it. As it turns out, a Morgan, or Morgan, is a Welsh term for a creature that entices men into its lair, usually with its beauty or enchanting voice, in order to drown or consume them. In the US, we might refer to this creature as a siren. I believe that it is likely these are the creatures that I encountered in the cave last night. And if this is the case, there is no doubt in my mind that they are responsible for the disappearances of a number of visitors and locals alike over the years, including my poor father. As I am telling you this, I am sitting on the back porch of the old vacation home. My flight leaves tomorrow morning, and I have one more night in the grubby little inn up the road. But something called me back here, telling me to look out over the darkened sea one last time. I sincerely hope that it wasn't the sound that brought me here, that beautiful, achingly sorrowful timbre that echoes up the bluffs and draws me closer, sounding so much more melodic than it did all those years ago. Leaning in, I can see the flecks of light on the water again, tipping hypnotically up and down as waves roll by beneath them. I feel sick to my stomach. My dad was wrong. They aren't anything like diamonds. Looking at them now, I can see them for what they are. Fake, dead, empty, like taxidermy. Dr. Chase Lopez stood close to the shoreline, his rubber boots mere inches from where the inky water lapped like tongues at the sand. To me, it looked as if he was teasing it. The ocean reached, but never quite far enough to touch. Dr. Lopez's face was buried in his cell phone.
"Come look at this, Len,"
he said. I hesitated to duck under the yards of yellow caution tape suspended around the beach, preventing locals and tourists from entering these waters. The stench of it was strong enough from where I stood. Dr. Lopez must have been drowning in it. The smell made the air seem heavy, like you were breathing in something solid. It stuck on my tongue, metallic. The ocean reeked of blood. It took me time, but I forced myself to walk closer to the source. Dr. Lopez held out his phone to me, and I had to squint and cup my hands over the screen to see it in the sunlight. The chemical analysis of the water, fresh from our main lab.
"Just came in,"
he said.
"and it's not oil. BP lives to see another day."
Then, what the hell is it?
"We don't know."
Dr. Lopez tucked his phone back into his pocket and looked to the ocean.
"Not yet, at least. I'm waiting for more to come through from Maine. That's just preliminary stuff." What does it smell like to you?
It smells like blood.
And it's so dark. Could be mass amounts of squid ink, however impossible that may be.
Chemical analysis would have clocked that.
Right. Well, not much we can really do but wait.
The ocean that stretched out before us was black. With a telescope on the ground and a helicopter in the sky, we could see that this dark patch existed 75 or so feet out from the shore. It was big, but not exactly oil spill big. When the black tide rolled in a few days ago, dead fish and other sea life began to wash ashore. The weird thing about the dead fish was that they didn't rot. By the time we arrived, they had been roasting on the beach for over 2 days. Yet, none of the expected effects of decomposition were present. They were in suspended animation. Dead, but not looking like it. Not even picked apart by gulls or other scavengers. The birds disappeared when the black tide rolled in. We found several species of fish native to this part of the Pacific, a few jellyfish, and one angel shark in the menagerie. They seemed so alive that, at first, we researchers tried to revive them. I put one orange fish inside a tank and was dismayed to find it floated belly up. There it stayed, never decomposing, for the remainder of our time on the island. On our second day there, Dr. Lopez told me that the lab results were inconclusive. Oh, what the hell does that mean? Can you at least tell me if it has sodium and chloride in it? It was supposed to be a joke, but Dr. Lopez just shook his head at me.
No, Len. I'm telling you, they don't know. Whatever it's made of, it's not something we've ever seen before. It's not even blood.
I sat down. I'd never gotten such devastating or exciting news. Something new. Something we could put our names on, but where to begin? How could we possibly know its dangers if we couldn't even tell what it was made of? I didn't know what reaction was appropriate to have. It has to be something, Chase. It came from Earth, didn't it? Maybe it's a chemical runoff that some goddamn plastic company shit out into the ocean. An experimental sort of thing.
They didn't detect any polymers. Not a bad guess, though.
Well, what do we do now? Are they running more tests? Dr. Lopez looked around the tiny space. We occupied a local resort room, which was converted to suit our needs as we did our research. The resort's residents were forced to evacuate when the black tide arrived, being fed bullshit reasons about a chemical spill. There were bunk beds that Dr. Lopez and I shared with 2 others, another marine biologist named Carmen, and an environmental engineer named Gabriel. The local military kept the area in a tight lockdown. No word of this would reach the news.
Maybe we dive,
Dr. Lopez suggested. I blanched. Chase, that substance killed those fish. Whatever it is, it's toxic.
We've got diving suits. It's the 21st century and won't touch our skin.
So we got ready to dive. It wasn't my place to refuse an order from my superior, but I knew that being scared was no viable excuse. Carmen agreed to dive with us, but Gabriel would go no further than the shore. He tagged along to watch from a safe distance. We slipped into diving gear and stood at the edge, just an inch from where the black tide sucked in and out. Carmen shrugged her shoulders at it.
Well, I guess I'll go first, if everyone's gonna be a pussy about it.
She walked out into the ocean. I watched her while holding my breath. I expected her to zip beneath the obsidian surface, pulled to her death by some terrible monster. I expected her to scream as the substance ate through her suit, and ultimately her skin. I expected her to collapse and die like the fish did, silently poisoned. None of this happened. Carmen waded out several yards until she could swim, then dived beneath the water. From the radio, she said,
"Come on in, folks. The water's warm."
Dr. Lopez and I followed her. The water was warm. As we sank beneath it, we noticed a peculiar phenomenon. The black tide sat on top of the water, never mixing. It was about 20 inches thick. The temperature difference was notable. The water below, the blackness, was freezing, almost as if it had been siphoned of its heat. I reached my hand into it, and it was a jarring sensation to feel such warmth while the rest of me shivered.
A strange sight indeed.
We were staring upward into space. That's what it looked like to me. If I close my eyes, I can go back to that moment. I'm suspended in the cold ocean, staring up at an inky night sky that blocks out the light of the sun. If I stare long enough, I see little pinpricks of starlight glitter throughout it. It's almost beautiful. It is beautiful. I feel compelled to go into it and remain there in its warm embrace, floating in the atmosphere, stars rippling around me. I started to swim upward. Then, a voice.
"Get out of the water,"
Gabriel commanded. Dr. Lopez caught my arm, and I came to my senses.
What's up, Gabe?
He asked.
"Get out now!"
We turned and swam toward the shore. The feeling of coming up through the black tide was indescribable, warm and wonderful. My skin exploded into goosebumps as I emerged from it. I wanted to go back. I was tired. I could sleep in that water. Carmen was the last one to emerge, and she walked backward. She knocked into Dr. Lopez and didn't seem to notice.
Jesus H. Christ!
She said.
What the hell?
I saw it. Saw them. A dozen shark fins slowly moving through the black water toward the shoreline. Each shark's fin was different. The tide gently pushed them ashore in a neat little row, heads facing us and tails toward the sea. There were 12 different species of shark. All of them dead.
Fuck.
Dr. Lopez said.
What are the odds?
The sight struck me numb. This felt purposeful, an arrangement made to be seen. A presentation. I couldn't get any closer. The water didn't feel inviting anymore. It felt hostile. Suddenly, I had the urge to look away from it, as if I had met a stranger's eye for too long.
That's an Atlantic sharpnose.
Carmen pointed at one of them.
How the hell is it here, in the Pacific?
"What is that one?"
Gabriel asked, pointing at another. This shark was not something I'd ever seen before. It was dark pink, almost red. Adorning its head were small horns arranged like a crown.
It can't be,
Dr. Lopez said. He walked to it and crouched down. Despite our protests, he grabbed the dead shark and inspected its head and the inside of its mouth. His fingers tapped along its teeth like he was a dentist, counting each one aloud, sliding his hand along the gills and peering into its eye. He finally stood, and I saw him trembling as he turned to us.
I could be wrong, but this looks like Hibuttus.
A what? I asked.
Opportunistic bugger. Really fast. Lived about 100 million years ago, if I remember correctly. It's been extinct since the late Cretaceous period.
None of us believed him. Carmen was the first to call him crazy. I didn't know much about extinct marine life. But I knew this wasn't possible. It might just look like a hibiscus, perhaps a mutated something else. We called for help and lugged the sharp nose and the maybe hibiscus back to our makeshift lab. Dr. Lopez called a marine archaeologist and a paleontologist. I went to the bathroom and inspected every inch of my skin. That intoxicating warmth was long forgotten. I was utterly disgusted at the thought of having been in that black water. I expected a red rash, weeping abrasions and infection, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just my skin. Something strange happened the next day. Gabriel began talking about the black tide like it was a person.
She did that on purpose.
He said at breakfast.
She wanted us to see those sharks.
Who is she?
Carmen asked. She was busy buttering a slice of bread. I watched her do it and noticed there was a minor cut on her pointer finger. Gabriel seemed irritated.
The black water. That was a message to us.
What kind of a message, Gabe?
Carmen taunted.
That it can resurrect sharks from a gazillion years ago? Give me a fucking break.
She's older than us. Much smarter.
They argued and I left. Dr. Lopez's people came later that afternoon with more equipment and knowledge. They fawned over the shark, spent hours alone in a refrigerated room with it, came out and swore to us it's an extinct species. They began calling more people, bigwigs from huge universities. This tide didn't seem like it was ours anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night to find that Gabriel was missing from his bunk. I couldn't go back to sleep. With rising concern, I surmised he may just be using the bathroom, taking a walk, talking to a loved one in a different time zone. But I knew that wasn't the case, so I rose from bed and went to the window. I saw Gabriel on the shore. He was walking toward the tide. Fear gripped me. It was like watching someone standing atop a skyscraper about to jump. Helpless panic. Impending doom. "Chase! Carmen! Wake up!" I shouted. "Gabriel's walking toward the fucking water!"
What?
Carmen groaned. Dr. Lopez rolled over to face the wall. I shook him harder, and he finally sat up.
Len, seriously.
"Can we please go check on him? I'm worried. I mean, why is he out there at this hour?" Dr. Lopez had been my supervisor for 3 years. Before that, he was my professor and personal advisor. He rarely said no to me. He got out of bed and followed me out of the resort and toward the black tide. The moon was full, and the beach was illuminated in pale blue. As we approached, I noticed that the light didn't reflect off the surface of the black water. It was consumed by it, like a void. It had been different in the sun. The rays reflect back at you, almost blinding. Why should the moonlight be different? Gabriel was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Lopez and I ducked beneath the caution tape and walked as far as we were willing to. The black tide was still. If I didn't know any better, I'd have said it was a solid sheet of blackness lying on top of the ocean. Vanta black. Blacker than black. Black hole. I wanted to touch it, to see if it was the same thing we encountered in the daylight or if something else had replaced it. Then Gabriel appeared. He was floating face down in the void, several yards from the shore. Slowly, his body began to move toward us. He looked like he was in space, a place where there are millions of light years between stars and planets, and there's absolutely no light. Just his partially submerged body, suspended in eternity, moving forward with such ease and purpose that there could have been a conveyor belt beneath him. My body felt drained of its blood. I was cold with fright. When I moved toward the water, Dr. Lopez grabbed me.
Don't.
He whispered.
Don't go in there.
Gabriel's body stopped floating toward us. It was frozen in the blackness, like a movie on pause. We stayed where we were, and I felt sick enough to puke. We can't leave him there.
I think.
Dr. Lopez started, then paused. I could hear him swallow.
I think it wants us to go in.
Gabriel's body reanimated and floated backward, away from the shore. I was disgusted with myself for not going after him. What if he's still alive? Not yet drowned? He floated back several more feet, stopped, and then started toward us again. I knew what Dr. Lopez meant now. These aren't the movements of the natural current. These movements are deliberate, teasing, controlled. Gabriel got close enough to the shore that we could touch him. With hubris, I crouched down and reached for his arm. Dr. Lopez jerked me away just as Gabriel zipped backward and slipped beneath the surface, blinked out of existence. TV turned off. We fell into the sand and scrambled away from the water's edge. Hot tears filled my eyes. Dr. Lopez was silent. We waited, unable to move. A few yards out, Gabriel's body appeared again, static in the void. In the daylight, we pulled Gabriel out using lifeguard equipment. He was dead, but he looked alive, asleep. When the paramedics put him on a stretcher, inky liquid spilled from his lips. We all jumped away from it. One paramedic cursed as they started to take him toward the ambulance, where a medical doctor would pronounce him dead at the hospital.
We can't allow this.
Dr. Lopez hissed. He ran after them.
Wait. We must keep the body here. The water may be infected, and it wouldn't be safe to take him to a hospital full of compromised people.
I knew what he was doing because I thought the same thing. I wanted to see if Gabriel's body was going to decompose. Carmen was oddly stoic when I gave her the news about Gabriel. She said something strange that made me uneasy.
He answered her call.
Perhaps she was making fun of him for the previous day's conversation, which seemed cruel even for gruff Carmen. As I sat with her, I noticed the cut on her finger was redder, inflamed. "What's up with your hand?" I asked. She hid it between her thighs.
Paper cut. It's been itchy, so I made it worse.
I wondered if she had that cut when we went diving. Somehow, Dr. Lopez convinced the paramedics to leave Gabriel's body with us. We took him, wrapped in a body bag, to the refrigerated room where we laid out some sharks and other dead things. He mentioned something about his pockets being lighter now, and I understood. Bribing a paramedic to leave our dead colleague's body here for us to study. Is this what we had come to? It was insanity. But at least Dr. Lopez succeeded in preventing any information leaks to the public. A tech from the main lab called us not long after we stored Gabriel in the room.
Have you noticed the phenomenon evaporating or dissipating at all?
No, It's still there. Nothing has changed as far as we can see.
Weird. All the samples you sent us are gone.
What do you mean, gone?
Well, it's gone. Completely vanished overnight. Now all we have are tubes of plain old Pacific Ocean water. We can't find a trace of the stuff anywhere.
I didn't know what to make of it. Neither did Carmen or Dr. Lopez. For the first time in my career, I felt stupid. More than that, I felt gullible, like I'd been tricked here on a wild goose chase. Paranoia compelled me to go back to the shore and see if the substance was still there. It was. We were stuck, unable to categorize the black tide, unable to make sense of the dead but not decomposing corpses, and unable to find answers. After the accident, it felt wrong to get close to it anyhow. Dr. Lopez didn't want to discuss the events of Gabriel's death with me, yet he had been the one to ascribe malicious intention to the water that night. Told me that it wants us to go in. And I believed him. Still do. Sometime later, Carmen amputated her hand. I found her on the floor in the bathroom, curled into a ball, soaked in blood. So much blood I thought she couldn't possibly have any left in her body. Somewhere in the mess was a hammer she'd used to break her wrist, and the saw that had done most of the deed. However, Carmen underestimated how difficult it would be to amputate a limb by herself. As I pried her arms apart, I saw her hand was still attached to her arm, if only by scraps of flesh and frayed tendons.
It got inside of me.
She wept.
I had to get it out.
Dr. Lopez wouldn't allow me to call the paramedics again. He put the little resort into lockdown. The archaeologist and paleontologist left despite his warnings, no doubt shaken by the recent death and mutilation. They would come back for the shark when the others arrived. I secured a tourniquet on Carmen's arm while Dr. Lopez removed the rest of her hand. We bandaged her, but she was catatonic. "Chase, we have to get her to a fucking hospital," I begged. "She needs a transfusion. She'll die."
We can't risk it,
he said. Dr. Lopez dropped the severed hand into a Tupperware container.
We don't know what the tide could do if it got out.
Got out? It's not some contagious disease.
We don't know what it is, Len.
Carmen never fully regained consciousness. Dr. Lopez took my phone when I was tending to her, leaving me unable to call for help even if I wanted to. I was terrified now, not just of the black tide, but of my supervisor. He was changing, paranoid, shifty. He spent nearly all day inside the fridge with the specimens. That night, I went out alone to the shore. I sat on the sand and watched the black tide sit motionless on the water, absorbing light, so dark it seemed biblical. I stared into the abyss for an eternity, waiting for something to be revealed to me, some divine vision. Pinpricks of light, just like the ones I had seen several days ago when we took our first dive. They came into view slowly, blanketing the tide with the night sky once more. Each one's luminosity ebbed and flowed like heartbeats. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I was sitting on the edge of a planet, gazing out into infinite space.
Len!
Dr. Lopez had come for me. I think it was to prevent me from escaping, to call for help. but he unknowingly saved my life instead. I snapped out of my dreadful trance and got to my feet. The stars were gone, and it remained as I'd seen it before, no longer beautiful, but repulsive in its vastness. Those stars must have been what Gabriel saw before he walked into the void. We went back inside, and he admonished me.
Think of what happened to Gabriel,
He said.
Do you want that to be you?
There's something wrong with it.
I know there is.
Then we heard it. Thumping, rhythmic like a heartbeat, coming from the fridge. Dr. Lopez and I approached it cautiously, standing in front of the door. I realized that the thumping was coming from lower, down on the thick door, perhaps just a foot or so off the ground. What is that?
I don't know.
Too terrified to open the door, we retreated to our beds. But the thumping continued throughout the night. Hours and hours I couldn't sleep, waiting for the sun to rise and make everything seem less frightening. It was nearly 5 a.m. when Dr. Lopez rose and declared enough was enough.
We're scholars, goddammit, and we're acting like children.
Chase, wait, I pleaded. He was right. We were like two kids afraid of the closet. We were scientists, doctors. The black tide didn't have thoughts or feelings. Gabriel drowned, and Carmen was mentally ill. There was an explanation for everything if he looked hard enough. We stood outside the fridge's door again, listening to the thump, thump. I stood behind Dr. Lopez as he reached for the handle and opened the door. Gabriel, naked on his hands and knees, continued to thrust his head into the space where the door had been. The top of his skull was bloody from hours of impact. The realization hit me like a brick to the face. He's alive! Dr. Lopez didn't move.
He can't be.
One shark fell from a shelf and flopped helplessly on the floor. Another followed. Then all the fish began to move. The room full of dead things animated, and they were all alive once more despite being out of water for several days. Wet slapping filled the air. Even the hibiscus was alive, wriggling its way toward the open door. Gabriel remained on his hands and knees, but dragged himself forward, head hanging limp between his shoulders as if it were too heavy to lift. A trail of black water dripped from his slack jaw. Dr. Lopez slammed the door on him. "Chase!" I cried. I wept freely now, unable to cope with the sight of the alive dead. "We have to help him. Open the fucking door."
He isn't alive. None of these things are alive. It's impossible.
I reached for the handle, but Dr. Lopez shoved me away. I stumbled backward and lost my balance, landing hard on the floor. He loomed over me.
Don't you dare.
How can you just leave him in there?
We're going to call the main lab.
Dr. Lopez pulled his phone out and rang the number right there, standing with his back to the fridge. It rang, and rang, and rang. No one answered. He cursed.
What the hell? They're a 24-hour lab, damn it.
He tried again. 3 more times. 2 more. He gave me my cell phone, and I tried them too. The lab didn't answer. Suddenly I felt the weight of our isolation. Gabriel's thumping resumed inside the fridge. The black tide was retreating. Dr. Lopez and I stood alone on the shore, watching the darkness shrink away from us. It was moving, all of it, floating slowly out into the open ocean as one great mass. The smell of blood dissipated as it got further away from the beach. "Where is it going?" I asked. Dr. Lopez shook his head.
I don't know.
We could hear Gabriel and the fish slamming around inside the resort from where we stood. They were louder, more frantic. Gabriel even began to scream, a long, hoarse wailing that filled me with a sense of dread and nausea. It was a mournful cry, something you might hear at a funeral as the casket is lowered into the earth.
I think,
Dr. Lopez finally said,
that they want us to go with it.
As the black tide melted into the horizon, I saw the stars glimmer across it once more. When I was a child, not even a teen yet, I was taken from my family. My mother had too many children, and I was the oldest. There is a chance that she sold me to support my siblings, but I would like to believe that the men who dragged me from my home threatened her, and the choice wasn't even a choice at all. For the next 10 years of my life, I lived on fishing boats, very rarely going ashore. This happens fairly often where I was born. Because of big fishing ships taking everything, locals needed to go further and further out, trying to get the scarce food to feed their families. Eventually, corruption rotted the fishing trade, so thoroughly every aspect of it was toxic. I believe if you start digging, you can find this information fairly quickly, but nobody wants to dig. No one wants to know the cruelty that goes into the fish fingers they feed their child when they are too tired to cook a real meal. Large fishing ships destroy the seas. What they don't keep, they kill. The smaller fishing boats that treat their unwanted catches slightly better are run by crime organizations and human slaves. I was one of those slaves, but I've seen how others were treated. I did not have my freedom, but on the boat, I ended up being treated almost like a human. I bounced around at first before remaining on that boat for 5 years. It was a decent size. It could carry 20 men, but that trip we had an extra 10. Those 10 were going to be transported to an island and then scattered to other fishing boats. We had only been on the sea for a few days, but with the cramped living spaces and heat of the year, everyone was in hot temper. Our captain, he could be a cruel man. Let's just put it this way. If you got sick, it was cheaper to toss you to the sea instead of getting treated. On that trip, his brother, N, was on board. I met him often while I worked on the boat. His brother was cruel in a different way. You did everything the captain did, but he made you still like him afterwards. As much as I wanted to, I could not entirely dislike the man. He spoke to me like an adult, and at times we shared fresh fruit with the crew. I suppose it was to keep us somewhat healthy when they couldn't afford to buy a new worker. If you could do anything, go anywhere, what would you do? N asked me one day, leaning on the railing, looking off into the sea. I only know how to fish, I answered back, not pausing in my work. N was like that. His kindness always had a motive behind it. He asked some of the others he had on the boat the same sort of questions. One boy answered, telling him truthfully about his dreams. N quickly got into the boy's head and found out that the boy and another man had a plan of escaping the boat. I never saw either of them again. I only hope they were sold somewhere else and not dumped overboard. The last time on that boat, N approached me again, trying to get me to open up about how the men were feeling. I knew he only wanted to know if a mutiny was brewing due to our poor conditions. How long have we known each other? 5 years? You've grown so much it's almost like you're our own child. How about you come up to the captain's room for a cold drink? This heat is gonna kill someone today, and I would like it if you live till tomorrow. N was smiling at me, fully expecting me to agree. I knew his plan and wanted to dislike him for it, but he made it impossible. No thank you, I'll be fine. The captain would be asleep trying to avoid the heat, so I was at no risk of him giving me a hard time. But if others on the boat saw me getting close, or any kind of favoritism, my life would become difficult. I saw N's face drop only a little. Even after the years, he still thought he was able to charm me. Still, I wish the wind would pick up. At this rate, we'll have to add an extra day to our trip. N commented. For a few hours, the wind had been calm and stopped altogether. Without the wind to cool us down, we would be too overheated to work the boat and required more rest. Because some men were promised to others, the captain had to care about their well-being. I only nodded in agreement with N staring at me. He planned on getting into my head, but gave up for that day. He would offer a different man a cold drink to try and get an inside look on how the crew was feeling. After he left me to my work, the oddest thing happened. Something I had never seen on the sea before. A fog rolled in. We saw it coming and tried to get the boat moving to avoid it, but it just swept in at an unnatural speed. I had of course seen fog on the ocean before, but never without a difference in temperature, and never so fast in the middle of the day. I was on the deck when it happened. I stared off trying to see anything in the dense mist. N had come out to the deck, looking as confused as the rest of us. Is that an island? Are we off course? He asked, his calm voice breaking. I could see a darker mass that did look like some sort of land off in the distance and through the mist. But we should not be near any land. It was not another ship. The shape was all wrong. It had to be an island, even though I had no idea how we would have gotten so far off course. We'll just wait out this mist and see where we are, I said, trying to keep working, even though my hands were shaking. I couldn't explain it. It was just mist, but the strange nature of it unnerved even myself. I was so busy trying to stay working I didn't notice a different man go to the railing of the boat and peer down into the sea. I did not know his name. It was easier on a person not knowing names of the people who passed through. There's a person down there! He shouted, panicked. I got up and rushed over to try and see what he was pointing out. N came beside me, and we all looked, spotting a pale form in the water. It was hard to see through the mist. As we were straining to see, another form came up. This one darker and easier to see than the first. Then another. And then another. Soon the ship was surrounded by human-shaped forms bobbing in the water. Did a ship crash? The man asked, his voice dry and shaking. I was frozen by the sight of it all. Breaking out of my shock, I ran over trying to find anything to toss out to try and save these people. If they could be saved. I was away from the railing when I heard the sound. I expected screaming or pleading from the people in the sea, but it wasn't that. It was a pleasant sound. A sound of voices mixed in with some sort of wind instrument I had never heard before, and never had heard since. My stomach turned into a ball of excitement. It fluttered with the music that surrounded the boat. I saw the other men come on board trying to find the source, their faces unable to be seen through the mist. Then I heard the first splash. Forgetting the strange, pleasant feeling, I turned my head just in time to watch a man jump over the railing, and then another. I saw N's form and rushed over to pull him away just as his body was starting to move, trying to get off of the boat. He thrashed in my arms, yelling at me, pleading to let him go. My years of hard labor made me stronger than him. If I could tie him down, I could move on to the next person and save them as well. I regretted I could only help one person at a time. I didn't know why I was even trying to save N first. He was the only man I could even remotely consider a friend, even after all the horrible things I had seen him do. As I was trying to save N, the men rushed to the railings, jumping off, shouting they heard their wives singing. For the unmarried ones, they were excited, shouting about hearing female voices and how they could see such attractive young women in the ocean, just waiting for them to be saved. It was all happening so fast, I almost ignored what N was shouting. "My daughter, she's out there. Let me go. I have to get her. I knew she wasn't dead. I just knew it. Her mother was lying. I didn't harm her, so let me go." My shaking hands were having trouble with the rope. I was almost able to get N tied down, but stopped when those words sank into my mind. The other men were jumping out in lust, completely overtaken by the song. They were seeing the women they loved, or just women they could love, and yet N was shouting about his daughter. The look in his eyes and how he struggled to be free made me nearly sick. I didn't confirm my feelings. I didn't need to. Everything had happened so fast. By the time I let N go into the sea where he belonged, the rest of the men had rushed out, leaving it impossible to save anyone. There had been innocent people on that ship, but I wasted my time trying to save the one man that committed such a horrible crime in his past. I could not let myself think of it. I just let him go and watched him in glee jump off the side without any hesitation. I knew I was alone, but I still heard the song. Standing in the middle of the deck, looking out at the bobbing shapes, I still felt a fluttering in my stomach, but not the same pull the other men had. I stood, waiting for something to happen, and I think the source of the song was also waiting. It knew I was still on the boat, so it sang, trying to lure me to the sea and with the rest. Slowly, I walked over closer to the railing to look out, but not to jump like the rest. In the water, the human shapes had their heads peeking above the surface, singing to me, but nothing else. I didn't see any signs of the crew in those waters. Eventually, the song stopped, and I think whatever was making it knew I wasn't going into the sea. Suddenly, the boat rocked as if something massive just passed beside it, or underneath it. I watched as the human form started to move all at once. Some came out of the water a bit more, and even through the mist, I could see they were only the upper half of a human. Long hair covered their faces, and limp arms moved with the sea. Their bodies formed into a long, thick, rope-like mass that disappeared under the water. They all moved as one as they started to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling. The image that those bodies were all connected to, an unseen mass deep in the ocean. Those bodies were like lights on an anglerfish. The song making their prey see those fake bodies as whatever they wanted to see. I was left alone with the boat on a silent ocean. The mist faded, leaving me with the horror of what just happened. I sold the boat and used the money to get as far away from the ocean as possible. No one knew how, but they thought I had killed everyone on board. I couldn't tell them the truth even if they did believe me. I would still be killed for selling the boat to a rival gang. I had a thought about why I was spared. Those men heard something that made them lust enough to jump out into sea, and that was the reason why I was spared. I never thought about it. I had no time to think about it working on those ships, but I had never had such desires. Even after I gained some freedom, I found myself never having the urge to get in a relationship with anyone. I don't know, but I don't think that creature had ever encountered something it could not lure out, and thus had no idea how to deal with such a situation. I also had thought about what the thing was. I think overfishing is the reason why that thing had come to the surface. Without its food source, it's trying to find the next best thing. The ocean is deep. We don't know what's under the waves, and I pray we never find out. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with the ocean. My mom hated it. She used to tell me all the time, if God intended for us to know about the ocean, he wouldn't have put so many obstacles between us and the bottom of it. I thought that was a bit reductionist. But when I insisted on studying biological oceanography and ocean engineering, she was as supportive as she could possibly be. College was the best time in my life. I loved my studies. My mom and I even bonded over it, as she let me tell her all about what I was learning about the ocean. Even though she didn't love the field I chose, she still pitched in for my education and encouraged me to live at home until I was done. She was my biggest supporter. 2 weeks after I graduated college, my dad died. And with his death, my mom seemed to lose all her will to live. She tried to hold on for me, but every day I could see the light slipping from her eyes a little more. She died the day after my interview for my dream job. And to this day, I'm convinced she did that on purpose. She knew her time was coming, and she waited so I wouldn't miss my interview. My friends always tell me that's a little morbid, but when I light candles for my mom's spirit, I can feel her there with me, and I know it's true. Anyway, I got the call with the job offer a few days after her funeral. Another small blessing that I knew came from her, and despite wanting to just lay down and give up on everything, I accepted the job. I was still heartbroken about losing both of my parents within a few months of each other, but the job was everything I had dreamed of and more. After a few years, I was given the opportunity to join a team that was researching previously unexplored parts of the ocean. I got assigned to the coolest place ever. The Bermuda Triangle. I know. We all grew up hearing stories about it, and most of them can be explained by science and weather patterns. But the stories that can't be explained by science, unfortunately, I can offer you an explanation for. Turns out my mom was right. Sometimes obstacles are there for a reason. The first few weeks of our research expedition were exciting. We had a place we were staying in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, but since that's still a good 640 miles from our research site, we also had a fairly nice boat we were staying on, and the team got funds for a submarine. I won't bore you with all the scientific details of our expedition, but after about 2 months, we were granted permission to send 4 people into the Bermuda Triangle in a submarine. Our team lead decided she would select 3 people to go with her, and out of our 11-person team, we knew there would be a lot of disappointed people. She said she would give us her decision individually to avoid the awkwardness for everyone who wasn't selected. I was a bundle of nerves for the whole week it took her to decide. But on a bright, beautiful Sunday morning, Marnie found me in my bunk and told me I had been selected. To be honest, a part of me knew deep down that I was going to be picked. There was no way all of these things would have lined up so perfectly just for me to be left behind while someone else went on the submarine trip. As it turns out, we would all be better off if someone else had been selected. 3 days later, we were ready to take the submarine down to the ocean floor. The people in our group were myself, Marnie, Jacob, a guy about my age named Evan, and the 90-person crew running the submarine. We all had hopes for what we would discover, but I think everyone was just elated to be a part of something so big. The first few days in the submarine were mostly spent getting our bearings, charting, mapping, and getting used to being so deep underwater. After that, we were able to use some pretty high-tech equipment that looked a lot like the suits astronauts wear to actually leave the submarine. I still lay awake at night and think about what that was like. The ocean was dark. It reminded me of fog, actually. The way you can see up to a certain point before it all blurs into one meaningless color. Only instead of fog, we were in an inky darkness all the time. I could see a few feet in front of me at any given moment, the wonders of the ocean hidden behind a cold, wet, dark veil, all there for me and my team to uncover. After a couple days of collecting samples and specimens, Jacob and I made a huge discovery. Caught between a rock and the ocean floor was a scuba suit, in a design neither of us had ever seen before. Our suits, top-of-the-line equipment not currently available to the public, looked a lot like spacesuits. This one looked like a toddler had tried to copy what we were wearing, but lacked the ability to really do it justice. The hands looked like mittens, almost exactly the way a small child would think to draw them. The helmet was oddly oblong and looked like a large bucket with holes cut out for the eyes and mouth. The eye and mouth holes were covered with glass, and the top of the helmet was rounded instead of flat like a bucket would be, giving it an odd misshapen appearance. The body was misshapen as well, with a barrel-like torso and uneven arms and legs. While I couldn't tell what the helmet was made from, it was clear that the body seemed to be made out of leather. The helmet and body almost seemed suctioned together. There was no zipper, no buttons, no way I could seem to dismantle it in order to put it on. More importantly, it was clear the suit was very old, but it showed none of the signs of damage that something like that should have after sitting at the bottom of the ocean for so long. Jacob and I glanced at each other, then rushed towards the strange sight as if we were both thinking the same thing. We worked together to move the rock off it, then cleared the debris that had gathered around the suit, mostly fish bones and small carcasses. We did so in complete silence, but despite the lack of words, I knew we were both beyond excited. Whatever this was, we were on the cusp of an incredible discovery. We freed the strange-looking diver's suit and carried it back to the submarine. An hour later, Jacob and I stood with the rest of the crew. Everyone hovered around the table we had placed it on. We had debated for a while if we thought it would hold up, bringing it out of the water and into a strange atmosphere, and Marnie logically decided we needed to resurface as quickly as possible so we could get the suit to a temperature and moisture-controlled storage facility. She told the submarine captain, and he said he would prepare us to resurface first thing the following day. In the meantime, Marnie told us to work our asses off to get as much done as possible before departure. She told us that if the submarine went back down, she would probably give other people on the team the opportunity to be on the crew. That was disappointing, but I agreed it was only fair. We put the suit in the storage room we had reserved for samples, locked the door, and went back to work. That night was when the first unusual thing occurred. Around 1 a.m, I woke up to piercing shrieks and raced out of my bunk into the hallway. One of the crew members, Rodriguez, was kneeling on the floor, clutching his head and screaming. The captain knelt next to him, trying to talk over the sound of his screams, but all we could hear was Rodriguez repeating over and over, "The eyes, it's eyes." Nobody knew what that meant, but his fear was both palpable and contagious. The captain assured us that sometimes people struggle with being underwater for very long, and Rodriguez would get the best medical and psychiatric care possible once we got back to the surface. He insisted we all go back to our bed, and everyone complied, slinking off to our bunks like a bunch of chastised children. The first thing I did in the morning was go back to the captain and ask if Rodriguez was okay. The captain smiled in greeting and assured me that Rodriguez was a bit sick, but they were sure he would be just fine. I thanked him, and as I was leaving, I heard him call out,
"If God wanted us to explore the ocean, we would have gills."
It was my mom's favorite joke. Every time I talked about new advances in oceanic technology, she would say that to me with a smile and pat me on the arm. I turned around and stared at the captain. "What was that?" I said. He was already facing away from me and glanced back over his shoulder.
"Sorry, what?"
I knew my face was tight, my voice reflecting my nerves. "What did you say?" "As I was walking away, you said something about exploring the ocean." He gave me a concerned look.
"Are you okay, Dr. Williams? I didn't say anything."
I nodded, every muscle in my body feeling like a tense rubber band. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you. I guess I was just lost in my thoughts." As I walked out, he muttered,
"Can't have another crazy on my ship."
I made my way back to the sample room, which was once again unlocked, and joined Marnie where she stood next to the area we had reserved just for the diving suit. Marnie had sent Evan out after Jacob and I came back to chip some pieces off the rock that had pinned the diving suit to the ocean floor, and he had also collected some bits of detritus around the area as well, like fish bones and other carcasses. I walked over and said, "Have you had a chance to crack the suit open?" Marnie smirked, knowing I was messing around, and said,
"Right, because I want to be the ocean version of the guy who destroyed the city of Troy. No, but there's the craziest thing."
I lifted an eyebrow, and Marnie went on,
"I don't think there's a body in here."
I looked over at the diving suit and felt a strange pang of fear shoot through me. How did it get down there then? Marnie shrugged, unbothered.
"Maybe it dropped off a boat or something. We might never get an answer to that, but we can do some testing on it and see when it was made and what it's made from."
I scooted away from the wetsuit, the room feeling claustrophobic now. "Have you had a chance to run any tests? Or are you waiting until we resurface?" Marnie started to answer when the door opened and a sheepish-looking crew member walked in. "Doctors, I'm sorry to bother you, but I have some bad news. We aren't going to be able to resurface today after all. We're experiencing serious technical issues," he said. Marnie and I both looked at each other, mirroring the panic on each other's faces, and in her best stern voice, she said,
"Define serious issues."
The crew member glanced over his shoulder as if he was waiting for someone to step in and take over for him. Then he replied, "I'll let you have that conversation with the captain. All he told me to pass along was that we're experiencing some strange weather that's interfering with the radar, and he doesn't feel safe resurfacing until it passes. He can lower us back to the ocean floor so you can continue your research, though." Marnie sighed and passed a hand over her face, looking weary.
"Yes, Tell him that would be good. And please, update us at your earliest convenience.
She stressed the word earliest with a look on her face that always made lab assistants duck their heads and promise to do whatever she asked. The crew member was no different, and he turned to flee quickly. Before he could escape, I said, "Wait, what about Rodriguez? Is he going to be okay?" The crew member went pale and said, We don't know. Captain Cameron says..." He stopped and squared his shoulders back. "He'll be fine. We'll get back to the surface as soon as we're able. And in the meantime, he's fine in medbay." I let him run out then, and turned to Marnie, who had already turned her own attention back to the samples. Before I could ask her thoughts on what was happening, she started giving me instructions, and I ran over to help her with the tests. If we had to be stuck underwater, we might as well be productive. While the equipment we had on the sub was good, it wasn't the equipment we needed to safely test the material of the suit, so we focused on analyzing the other specimens we took from the site instead. As we worked, I felt like the suit was a third person in the room, watching and judging silently as we worked. Jacob and Evan joined us at some point, and the four of us made plans for how we would use our time until the sub could resurface. Marnie was mostly frustrated that we didn't have a timeline. She wanted to map out as much time as possible, but hesitated to do that if she didn't know how much time we had. Jacob and I encouraged her to schedule our days as if we were going to be staying for the full 5 days we would have had left, and promised to do all our top priority items first. With that settled, we went to the mess hall for dinner. When we got there, I noticed that there seemed to be fewer people than usual. Rodriguez was missing, obviously, but I also noticed one of the female crew members I had started bonding with was gone too. I grabbed my food and sat down across from someone I had seen talking with her before. I smiled and said, "Hi, I'm Matt Williams, one of the researchers. Do you know where Claire Mason is?" The crew member, I thought his name was Reynolds, gave me a weird look, then shook his head, stood, and left his half-eaten tray of food where it was. I watched Reynolds walk away, feeling equal parts confused and irritated. A few minutes later, Marnie walked over and grabbed my arm. In a harsh whisper, she said,
"You need to come with me."
I stepped out into the hallway, feeling anxiety wringing my stomach like a dish rag. Marnie didn't say anything, but we walked down the hall until we reached sickbay. Once we got there, Captain Cameron stepped out with a concerned look on his face. I had last spoken with him that morning, and in that time it was as if he had aged 20 years. He waited for us to step inside.
"Thank you both for coming. I'm sorry to be treating this so clandestine, but I have some concerns. I think you'll understand."
He took a deep breath before continuing.
"We seem to be having a problem with psychosis on board. You both saw what happened to Rodriguez. In the last 24 hours, we've had 2 more crew members experience the same thing. That may not sound like a lot, but when you're on a machine like this one, you need every person to be in the best health possible."
He stepped aside and we saw Rodriguez, Claire, and another crew member I thought was named Anderson, all laying in their beds. They were asleep. They seemed peaceful. Cameron continued.
"They're sedated. Every time they wake up, they start screaming again, and we want to keep this quiet from as many people as possible. I told the crew we believe there's a bout of mono going around, and to be cautious and stay out of sickbay. It's not a good solution, but it's what we have right now. I need you two to see if you can figure out what's going on."
Marnie lifted an eyebrow and put one hand on her hip.
"We're not equipped for that, Captain. Neither of us have a degree in medicine or psychology. Don't you have a doctor on board?"
Captain Cameron gave her a look that I can only describe as pure desperation.
Our medic isn't equipped for this either. We don't have a psychiatrist for this expedition because it was supposed to be a short one. Please just do blood tests. Something. Work with our medic and use any of his equipment that you need to. Figure out what's going on.
Captain Cameron left and I turned to Marnie and said, "This all started the night after we found the diving suit. Do you think we brought some kind of bacteria into the ship that's making people sick?" Marnie winced.
Shit, I hope not. But maybe we did. I'll go take a sample from it and see if there's anything weird. You go finish your dinner.
She started to leave, then stopped.
And Matt, do not speak a word of this to anyone. We want to keep this quiet.
I sulked back to the mess hall, feeling like my trip of a lifetime was slowly blossoming into a nightmare. I finished my food, then went back to sickbay to check in with Marnie. She wasn't there, and the medic was back, but he hadn't seen her either. Concerned now, I went back to the storage room. Sitting on the floor in the corner of the room was Marnie, tears flooding her eyes looking hollow and glassy. I ran to her side. Marnie, are you okay? What's going on?" She didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there like a shell of a person. I ran from the room to the sickbay and told the medic what was going on, then went to the control room to look for the captain. When I told him what happened to Marnie and what our suspicions were, his face grew hard. He said,
Lock the room you've got that thing in, and don't let anyone touch it. If one more person gets sick, I'm making you and your team get rid of it, and I'll make you bleach the entire storage room to make sure no one else gets sick.
I apologized for all the trouble, agreed to his conditions, and left to update Evan and Jacob. I know Marnie told me not to, but with her out of commission, I needed as much support from the rest of our team as possible. When I got to the bunk area, Evan and Jacob were both looking tense. They motioned me inside and we huddled together on Jacob's bed. Jacob leaned in and whispered,
"About 20 minutes after you and Marnie left, we heard screaming. Rogan this time. He was in the hallway near the storage room, clutching his eyes and..."
Jacob hesitated as if he wasn't sure how to explain it.
"He was begging for forgiveness. I don't know what about or to whom, but he kept saying, 'I didn't mean to. I'm sorry,' over and over."
Evan took in a shaky breath and said,
"We try to help, but the person you were sitting with before Marty grabbed you, I think his name is Reynolds, he pushed us away and told us not to say anything."
My mind reeled. It seemed like something about the suit really was making people sick. Maybe Rogan had gone into the storage room for some reason. Or maybe, an even worse thought, the bacteria on the suit that was causing this had migrated from the storage room somehow. An image popped into my head of invisible bacteria crawling on the floor, lit by a black light showing it moving in waves towards new victims. I looked up at my two teammates and said, "Cameron, Marnie, and I think the diving suit we found might have something to do with all this. Like, maybe there's some kind of bacteria on it causing all this. And with Marnie in sickbay now too, I think we may be right." We all stared at each other for a long time.
"This is bad,"
Jacob said. Evan and I nodded in our agreement. Then Evan asked,
"Well, now what do? We can't get rid of the suit. Who knows what kind of discoveries we can make with it? And..."
He cast his face down.
"And this discovery could put our names on the map, you know? We could be something."
"Safety is far more important, Evan. Don't sacrifice lives to have your name on a plaque in some museum."
He turned back to me and said,
I think we need to put the diving suit back in the ocean, Matt. Some things weren't meant to be found.
I looked back and forth between Evan and Jacob, feeling the weight of being the tiebreaker resting on me like an anchor. Finally, I made the worst mistake of my life. I think we should try to stop whatever this is before we put the diving suit back. We came all this way, and I think it's what Marnie would want. I could tell Jacob wanted to argue with me more, but when I mentioned Marnie, he closed his mouth and lowered his eyes. We agreed to meet in the storage room in an hour to try and find a way to keep the suit quarantined so no one else would get sick. The running theory was that some kind of bacteria was causing encephalitis, swelling in the brain, that was causing hallucinations and catatonia. We didn't have the right tools on board to properly diagnose them, but it was a good place to start. The three of us split up to look for supplies that might help. Evan left to look for cleaning supplies. I went to medbay to get masks and gloves, and Jacob simply said he had an idea and ran off on his own. We all had agreed to meet up outside the men's quarters again, which were thankfully on the other side of the building from the storage room. A little after 9, I rejoined Jacob in the hallway. When he saw me, he sighed and said,
I knew it. I have a bad feeling.
I lifted an eyebrow. What do you mean? He gestured around us vaguely.
Evan isn't here. I haven't seen him since we parted ways. And finding cleaning supplies shouldn't have taken very long.
I shook my head and handed in the gloves and mask. Throw these on and let's go check. Jacob sighed again.
I had hoped to stay away from that area until we could deal with this. But all right. Let's go.
We walked to the storage room together, and when we got there, Jacob pulled me gently away from the door so he could enter first. When we walked in, neither of us were surprised to see Evan laying on the floor, hands over his head, sobbing. Jacob and I walked over and dragged Evan to his feet and carried him to sickbay. When we got there, we found a horrible sight. Somehow, in the last hour, 10 more crew members had gotten sick. We had started with smaller crew, around 90 crew members, 30 people per shift, 3 shifts if I remember correctly. Since we were a smaller sub, we didn't need as many people. We were now down 15 people, including Marnie and Evan. We were quickly turning into a skeleton crew, and while I didn't know very much about submarines, I had a feeling that was really bad. After we dropped Evan off, Jacob and I went to find Captain Cameron. We opened the sickbay door, and before I could process what I was seeing, Jacob had pushed me to the floor and slammed the door shut. Walking down the hallway was the diving suit. It slumped and lurched as though only one part of it at a time was able to hold itself up. We watched through the port window in the door as a crew member came around the corner and ran into the diving suit. The man smirked, as though he thought someone was playing a prank on him, and looked into the eyes of the mask. His face fell, his eyes widened, and he began sobbing.
I tried. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to let her drown. I was only a kid.
He continued to sob, curling up into a ball on the floor as the diving suit continued to move. Jacob pulled me away from the window and placed his back to the door, blocking the port. We stared at each other in silence for a long time before he said,
Okay, this is fucking bad.
I nodded, feeling panic wrapping its cold, clammy hands around my throat. What's happening? Is someone in the suit? Jacob took slow, steady breaths, and I did my best to copy him. After a few minutes, he said,
I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think we can explain this.
He turned and looked out the window again and took a deep breath.
We need to get back to the men's bunk. I grabbed our wetsuits, and I think we'll need them.
I was able to manage a small smile. Jacob was a good person to have on my team. We made our way out of the med bay, both of us shielding our eyes with our hands to avoid looking directly at the eyes of the suit. As much as I wanted to believe there was some logical answer, it seemed like people were having breakdowns only after looking in its eyes. We moved slowly, taking small, careful steps as we walked down the hallway. We could hear more screams echoing around the ship. They seemed to be coming from the other side of the ship, which was good. But it wouldn't be hard for the creature to catch up with us, or whatever that thing is. We finally got to the bunk room, and Jacob threw the door open, both of us barreling inside quickly, and we collapsed to the floor in a relieved heap. Jacob was breathing heavily, his face red, and I was worried he might have a heart attack. I found a bottle of water and passed it to him, then waited for him to recover. Finally, his breathing steadied, and he nodded to me gratefully, then pointed across the room to where 3 diving suits sat on his bunk. I rushed forward and carried his over first, then grabbed my own and put it on. Once we were both fully suited up, I turned to Jacob and asked, "What now?" He gave me a stern look and said,
"We have to get that thing off of the ship. It's too risky to try to contain it."
I felt the words like a deep blow and hung my head with shame. "You're right. I'm sorry." Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and gave me a tight smile.
"We'll make this right. Don't worry about it too much."
We both put our helmets on and stepped into the hallway. Jacob carried the body of the 3rd diving suit. I carried the helmet, and we made our way towards the control room, hoping Captain Cameron would be in there. The plan was to find Captain Cameron and get the word out around the ship that the thing could only hurt you if you looked into its eyes. We still weren't entirely sure what happened if you looked at it, but what we had seen so far was disturbing enough that neither of us wanted to try. I followed Jacob through the ship as he led us away from the screams, taking a more circuitous route to the control room as we avoided the shambling creature. When we arrived at the control room, Captain Cameron beckoned us with a relieved look on his face. There were 11 crew members crammed into the small control room, and once we joined them, we were officially at capacity. We handed Captain Cameron the diving suit and explained the plan. He nodded, looking grim, and said,
"That's better than risking anyone else's safety. How about I lead the creature towards the exit hatch as a distraction? You two just get over there safely and wait. Novak will watch the cameras in there and release the hatch once you 3 and the creature are safely inside."
He gave us a pitying look.
"I wish I didn't have to put you two in so much danger, but I don't see another option."
Jacob and I both nodded resolutely. It was my decision to bring this thing on board. I want to do what I can to make it right, I said. Jacob put his hand on my shoulder and said,
"I was involved in that decision too, and I second this one. Let's fix our mistake."
Captain Cameron nodded, slipped into his diving suit, and the 3 of us stepped into the hallway. Jacob pointed to the right and then at Captain Cameron and nodded, then pointed to the left and gestured for me to follow him. We made our way down the hall, towards the exit hatch. It was a sealed, pressure-controlled room that we could use to come and go for specimen collections. It was also exactly big enough to hold me, Jacob, and the creature. The few crew members we passed, we warned about what was happening, and told them to hide somewhere safe and keep their heads down. I was starting to get nervous about the number of people we had sedated in medbay now. I don't know exactly how many people it takes to run a submarine, but with people dropping like flies, we had to be down to the wire. It wasn't long before we could hear scraping and shuffling coming down the hallway towards us. Captain Cameron rounded the corner, walking backwards with his head down. I glanced at Jacob and realized that if the thing pursued Cameron instead of us, we would never be able to get rid of it. I stepped away from the doorway and put myself between the creature and Captain Cameron. It didn't break stride, but when Cameron shuffled off to the side, it didn't change course to pursue him. I took over, walking backwards, until I made my way into the isolation room. It shambled after me, but didn't stop when I put my back against the wall. It kept moving towards me until it had me pinned against the exit hatch. I kept my eyes down, but called out in a shrill voice laced with panic,
"Jacob, it's got me pinned."
Just as I finished speaking, I felt a hard slam and glanced up just enough to see the creature reeling back before slamming its head into my helmet again. I watched in terror as a small spiderweb appeared in the glass. The creature put its hands on either side of the helmet to hold me in place, just as Jacob was able to open the hatch behind us. Water rushed in, and the creature was sucked out into the inky blackness. I had been able to get a good look at its hands before it was sucked out, and my stomach sank with dread. I was almost certain the suit was stitched from human skin. Even with that fresh panic, I was thrilled. Gravity and physics took care of the problem for us. Then a leathery hand reached back inside, wrapped itself around my ankle, and yanked me into the cold, dark ocean. Despite our depth, I could tell a storm was raging above us. The water would briefly light up with a lightning flash, revealing the tide battering everything in its path on the surface. I could only see the creature when the lightning would flash, but I could tell it was trying to get back to the submarine, with me in tow. I fought and kicked, trying to get away, but the grip it had on me was inhuman, making all my struggles to get away seem meaningless. I was about ready to give up hope when I saw something come down on the creature's hand. Jacob had found a large rock and brought it down on the wrist part of the suit. It weakened the thing's grip just enough for me to get away, and I crawled backwards. In the momentary flashes of light, I could see Jacob fighting to get away, and I began searching for a rock too. I could see the spiderweb in my helmet growing, and I knew it wouldn't be very long before the pressure would break through and drown me. I found a medium-sized rock and fought against the water pressure to lift it. At some point, Jacob got free from the creature and helped me lift the rock, and together we carried it to where the creature was pinned by the rocks Jacob had been able to grab, struggling to free itself. We dropped the rock on its sternum as the lightning flashed, illuminating the thing's eyes. Just as I looked at them. Instantly, I was transported somewhere else. It was a sunny day in November, unusually warm and bright, and I walked down a hospital hallway. I was moving slowly, even though the nurses had called me to hurry. I had been scared. I knew my mom was close, and I wasn't ready to say goodbye. I think part of me had hoped that if I never got to the room, I would never have to see her die. In a sense, I was right. I didn't watch her die, because she had already passed when I got to the room. The nurse said if I had only been 1 minute earlier, I might have been able to say goodbye. In the memory, I sank to my knees in the doorway of my mom's room and began weeping. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned around, expecting to see a doctor, but instead I found myself looking right in the face of the diving suit. When we made eye contact, I was plunged again into a memory. This time I found myself kneeling at my dad's grave, as my mom sobbed beside me. It was the moment I had known I would lose my mom as well. One of the most painful days of my life. Again, I felt a hand on my shoulder, but this time I looked down, saw the human leather glove, and closed my eyes tight. I felt the creature turn me around, could feel its face inches from mine, but I refused to open my eyes. I could feel its rage radiating out from it as the hands moved from my shoulders to my sternum and began tearing my chest cavity open. The fingers sank into the soft skin and tissue in my chest, biting through the meat of my flesh and wrapping around my bones. I could feel my ribcage bending and instinctively opened my eyes as I screamed. I was instantly plunged into another memory. This one from the time I had dealt with a bully in college. But this time I was ready, and as soon as I felt the creature's hand on my shoulder, I bolted. I ran through the hallways of my old college until it faded into the green and gray of the cemetery my parents were buried in. I forced myself not to falter as I ran past my crying mother, the creature still shambling after me. The cemetery faded until it was replaced by the hospital, and I continued to run despite the burn in my chest and arms. I reminded myself it was a dream, a hallucination, but the terror remained. After what felt like years, the hallway faded into black, and I woke up. When I woke, I was in a regular hospital bed. Marnie was in the bed next to me, the curtain between us pulled back. Her face looked drawn and tired, older than I remembered. I took a moment to get my bearings, then pressed the call button for a nurse. A nurse wearing light purple scrubs walked in and lifted her eyebrows in surprise when she saw me.
Oh my God, you're awake! This is incredible. Let me call your doctor.
She rushed over and did something on the computer next to me, took my vitals, then ran from the room. She entered a few minutes later with a doctor in tow. They fussed over me for a while and gave me a little information. But I got the real story from Captain Cameron when he arrived. Captain Cameron, or Nate, as he told me to call him, told me what had happened. He said that Jacob and I had just managed to pin the creature when I had fallen to my knees and begun sobbing. Jacob carried me back to the submarine and put me in the isolation chamber. When they opened it, I was there and catatonic. But Jacob was nowhere to be seen. They weren't exactly sure what happened to him. They think he got grabbed by the creature, or maybe it was starting to get free and he ran back to stop it. Either way, Jacob had sacrificed his life to save mine. They hadn't been able to recover him. As soon as the creature was securely trapped, the storm had calmed, and what was left of the crew had taken the submarine back to the surface. It was a hard journey. Apparently, the storm had been a rough one, and on a skeleton crew, it was extra hard. Apparently, by the time we had gotten the creature off the ship, a total of 41 crewmates had been affected by it. Those of us who had been affected by the creature were taken to the hospital, and according to Nate, only a few of us woke up. I was among the first group to wake up, and even now, almost 6 years later, 8 of those people are still catatonic. I take responsibility for every single one of them. Marnie woke up eventually, and even though she said she didn't blame me for what happened, I was still removed from her team. That's okay. I'm not as interested in the ocean as I used to be. It turns out, the ocean hides some secrets for a reason. Dad was drunk again. Rain swept over my windshield like waves over a beach as I drove him home from yet another bar where he'd made a fool of himself. He wasn't the drunken brawler type. No, he was a crier. He'd sit at the bar with his head on the table and just start sobbing, wailing, bringing down the whole mood of the place. Even now, he shifted between crying and sniffling while staring out the passenger window, in half-conscious states where he couldn't muster the mental coherence to even register such complex emotions. At one point, he even leaned over the center console and tried to hug me, almost making me jerk the steering wheel. "Dad, no. Christ, I'm trying to drive here," I snapped at him. "Keep on your half of the car or I'm pulling over." Like a loyal dog, he recognized the tone of my words, even if not their meaning, and shrunk back sheepishly. Since I was in elementary school, people told me I was remarkably mature for my age, but you kind of have to be when you're forced to act like the parent of the family. The road traveled parallel to our sole local river, the one the school kids all called the Devil's Gutter. It snaked in and out of sight behind the tree line, as if it liked to taunt every driver that passed. The damned thing was evil. I knew, but I couldn't help but feel a certain nostalgic fondness for it. It was the only thing offering any sense of danger and mystique to what have otherwise been the least interesting small town in the country. From a glance, it seemed mild, shallow, and narrow enough to make it across with a leap. There was no way of telling that it was actually hundreds of feet deep, that the undercurrent was stronger than what an Olympic swimmer could withstand, that the banks were undercut and impossible to climb back up once you were in, that the carbonated water had intricately carved networks of hundreds of channels and caves deep into the limestone. Misjudge your leap, and you'd be seized by the undercurrent, dashed against the rocks, plunged deep into some dark cave within which your body would be preserved forever, pinned to a wall or ceiling of stone like some macabre decoration. The gutter features in our every folk tale and ghost story. When I was a kid, we liked to tell the tale of old Bart O'Neill, a 19th century prospector whose cat was apparently very popular with the neighborhood toms. Every time she'd get knocked up, it was said, he'd gather up the kittens into a burlap sack and toss them all into the Devil's Gutter. At least, and this was when whoever was telling the story would lower their voice to a whisper, until they found his body in his bed, shredded by hundreds of small claws. His eyes had been clawed out, his fingers bitten off like carrots, rib cage torn open. And within his chest, the police found dozens of tiny poops. That's right. According to the legend, the spectral kittens had used his chest cavity as a litter box. It was all made up, of course, the crude invention of imaginative schoolboys. But I have looked through old newspapers and found that someone named Bart O'Neill really did disappear from town a long while ago. No gory details, just up and vanished. The only oddity I noticed was that when his cat was found, still locked up in a cage in his shed a week after his disappearance, it was well fed. As if somebody had been sneaking in and caring for it. See, this is why I hate taking this road. With every glimpse of that river, my mind always wanders back to old memories. Terrible memories. Ones that would have been better left forgotten. It ignites a fire in me, a sort of morbid curiosity I have come to dread. But then Dad broke my line of thought with a long, obnoxiously loud groan. And then I was thinking of the first time I had him in my passenger seat, when I was some anxiety-ridden kid, no older than 15. Didn't even have my driver's license yet. Hands shaking late that New Year's night as I struggled to dodge all the other drunk morons swerving all over the road. New Year's was always the worst night for him. "This would have been our anniversary," he was groaning. "It would have been our 15th. I got over what happened to Mom over a decade ago. Why couldn't he? We aren't the only people who've experienced loss, anyway. When I was growing up, the whole town mourned the death of Annabelle, captain of our high school cheerleading squad. She tried to jump the gutter, and even cleared it. But there'd just been rain, and the muddy opposite bank gave way beneath her feet, and she went right in. Crazy thing was, 15 minutes later, they got a ping from some SOS beacon her mother had made her wear. They took this as proof she'd made it out alive but injured, and triggered a frantic search of the surrounding area, with no luck. There were rumors, however improbable, that she'd found her way into an air pocket somewhere in that limestone cave system, just close enough to the surface that just one of her desperate calls for help managed to make it through. Sometimes I picture her down there, in a kind of darkness I cannot fathom, struggling to keep her head above the water. I wonder if she knew that surrounding her, somewhere in the dark, were the corpses of those who had been pulled into those caves before her. I picture a gaunt, bleached hand brushing her ankle as those currents carry one by. I imagine her crowded on all sides by the gaunt, empty eyes of the people who'd found their way into that air pocket before her, and never found their way out. Maybe it was for the best that she would have been in complete darkness. There went my mind again. I'd gotten another glimpse of the river, and couldn't help but imagine Anna down there, as if her eyes were looking up at me from beneath those blackened waters. I tried to turn up the radio, to take my mind off it and drown out Dad's moaning and sobbing. But he grunted as if the very sound offended him, and drunkenly pawed at the dashboard until he turned it back off. I already knew what he'll say tomorrow. "I've let you down," he'd say, head down like a dog caught peeing on the carpet. "I've never been the father I should have been." And it'll all be very genuine, and very sincere, and very, very temporary. I've even helped pay for his rehab once. He'd been found, choked half to death on his own vomit. "This is a wake-up call," he'd said. "I'm finally ready to be the dad you've always needed me to be." A few grand seemed like a small price to pay to have my dad back. And indeed, for a few months of sobriety, he was the best dad on earth, the best I ever could have asked for. And then came New Year's again, and it was suddenly like none of it ever happened. My eyes glimpsed a cross set up along the gutter, a bouquet left at its base. I knew exactly who it was for. When I was in 4th grade, Bethany, a little girl who went to the same school as me, was swallowed up by the gutter. Her father was the only one who witnessed the accident, and there'd been some suspicious circumstances. I don't really remember. Something about marital issues, custody, that sort of thing. Point was, everybody suspected him. But what proof did they have? The gutter never parts with its secrets. 3 years or so later, her dad just up and vanished too. Nobody thought much of it at first. Everyone assumed he got tired of the side eyes and just skipped town. But then, months after everyone had forgotten the whole business, someone started sending around a voicemail he'd apparently sent out at 3 a.m, the night he disappeared. It had apparently been sent to some random coworker from his contacts list. An accident, clearly. The first minute or two just consisted of the sort of rustling you'd expect from a pocket dial, so they hadn't thought much of it. It hadn't been until their curiosity drove them to investigate deeper that they realized they could hear the dad's heavy, belabored breathing and the sounds of twigs and leaves crackling beneath his feet, as if he were wandering through the middle of the woods. Moreover, off in the distance, they could hear another voice. The faint voice of a little girl, bubbly and giggling, like they were playing a game. "Daddy," the voice kept crying out into the night. "Daddy, where are you?" They noticed, too, that you couldn't hear any crickets or birds or anything else you'd expect out in the forest at night. Everything was dead silent, like all the creatures of the woods sensed the presence of a predator. The dad's breathing grew heavier and more panicked whenever the voice grew louder, nearer, but it remained stifled, as if he was desperately trying to keep quiet, remain unnoticed. Eventually, she was so close that you could hear her little footsteps in the leaves, and the dad didn't even dare to breathe. And then, the sound of branches being parted, the father's gasp, and that little voice laughing and declaring in a sing-song tone, "Daddy, I found you." And at that exact moment, the voicemail reached its limit. The cop's official line was that it was fake, just some audio doctored up by bored teenagers to feed into the sensationalized mythology of the Devil's Gutter. But Bethany's remaining relatives swore up and down that they recognized that giggly little voice, that it was unmistakable. Lost in thought, I blinked, and somehow, in that moment, a woman appeared in the middle of the road. I can't remember the next few seconds. It was as if I'd time traveled. One moment I was driving along, and the next I was stuck in a muddy ditch on the roadside, the hood just inches away from an oak tree sturdy enough to have bisected my car. And Dad was just screaming like a madman, incoherently at first, but then congealing into a name. "Jessica!" He was screaming out for Mom, I realized. "Jessica!" And as he screamed, he threw open the passenger side door and tore off into the woods in a drunken stumble. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman was still standing there in the road, a vague silhouette barely illuminated by whatever moonlight broke through the storm. But when I looked back with my own eyes, she was gone. I cursed like a sailor as I took off into the storm, blindly in the direction I thought my dad had went. My heart was in my throat. We were so close to the gutter. In this state, he could so easily fall in, become just another name in its long list, another creepy story to tell on school playgrounds. But then it became clear I was in the same danger. The storm was picking up rapidly, sideways rain blasting my eyes, wind tugging at the trees by their roots. Yet somehow, stupidly, what terrified me most was the prospect that while stumbling through those darkened woods, I might hear a little girl's voice off in the distance shouting, "Daddy." Suddenly I froze in place. I realized I could hear the bubbling and crashing of the gutter's current, even over the storm. It must be so close. I tried to look for it, but the rain seared my eyes whenever I was not covering them with an arm. I was too terrified to take a step in any direction, but the storm took action for me by sweeping away the mud beneath my feet. Anna's fate flashed in my mind, the muddy bank giving way. My death wasn't even going to be original. I thrashed and floundered, feeling like the earth seemed to envelop me from below like a massive creature pulling me into its gullet. Through sheer luck, my random grabs caught purchase. A thick, sturdy tree root was all that saved me from the waters below, and I clung to it with every scrap of strength I had, even as the rain left it soaked and slippery. I managed to hold on for a while, with no way back up but unwilling to let go of my only lifeline. And then I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. My body tensed with such horror that I lost my grip in an instant, and those cruel waters had me. They seemed to toy with me for a while, spinning me about under the surface as I curled up into the fetal position. The shock of the frigid cold caused me to suck down a breath instinctively, filling my lungs with water. As I scratched at my chest, my eyes opened for just a split second. On either side of me were those thick limestone walls, pockmarked with the black abysses that were caves, and that limestone led down below, far below, disappearing into that infinite, inky blackness beneath me. The experts' guesses must have been wrong. The gutter couldn't just be a few 100 feet deep. It had to be a mile, at the very least. Just looking down into that darkness, I felt the same sense of vertigo as I felt looking down from the roof of the Empire State Building. That, and an overwhelming sense of things looking up at me, staring back. It reminded me of joining the theater group as a kid, standing on a stage for the first time and realizing that there were over 100 pairs of eyes on me, watching me, expecting a performance. Except this time, I knew they were here to watch me die, watch me become one with them, sink down far below the surface, and join them in all that darkness, never to see the sunlight again, except vaguely through the surface of the water, miles above my new home. But even that didn't terrify me quite as much as the prospect of landing in one of those caves. Even as the undercurrent bashed me savagely against rocks and my lungs cried for air, my only focus was avoiding them. I swear, I could see bloated arms and grasping hands reaching out from the dark in each cave, grasping for me as I passed by, as if each occupant was lonely, desperate for a companion in their eternal resting places. Suddenly, the current bashed my head against a rock, and from then, everything was abstract and fuzzy. I could only muster a single coherent thought. Please, not here, it went. Don't let me die here. Somehow I knew that if I died beneath these waters, my soul would never break the surface. As if to answer my prayer, a pair of arms settled around me. Not the cold grasping claws reaching from the caves, but something warm and comfortable, embracing me, cradling me close in a way that told me everything would be okay. Again, the next few seconds were a blur. I have no explanation for how I ended up back on the shore, shivering from the freezing waters and hacking, retching, emptying the water from my lungs upon the mud. All I know is, when I looked up, a bolt of lightning briefly illuminated the stone memorial looming above me, upon which read, "In loving memory of Jessica Whitaker." I know everything about the mythology of the Devil's Gutter, because I was a part of it. My family is one of those the school kids whisper about, the ones they make up wild stories and creepy theories about. Terminal cancer, they'd say around the campfires. That was so horribly painful that not even the morphine could do anything for her. She'd been a painter, you know, always drawing portraits of the gutter. She was the only person who thought it was beautiful, not evil. So the legend goes, she begged her husband, "Please, take me to the river. Let me become a part of it. I don't want to hurt anymore." They say that they did it on their anniversary, New Year's Day. I heard a long, choking grasp. For a moment, I was almost relieved. I thought it was another one of my father's drunken groans. Then I realized it was coming from the river itself. I turned and beheld a dozen hands reaching out over the side of the banks. Unnameable things pulling themselves up from the river. I only caught vague glimpses of the crawling, groaning creatures, briefly illuminated by the lightning. Their skins were bleached white and transparent, looking like road maps made of veins and arteries stretched taut over gray muscles and jagged ribs, with putrid organs. Many were missing legs, arms, even heads. Others were more ancient still, mummified strands of flesh seemingly loosely stitched to the crumbling remains of a skeletal structure. All seemed to be looking right at me, even though none of them had any eyes to speak of, only empty black sockets. They were crawling forward with horrid determination. Once the gutter had taken you into its waters, laid its claim to you, it never wanted to let you go. They were only coming to retrieve what they were owed. I tried to crawl away through the mud, but it felt like crawling in a bad dream. It felt like the very planet was turning sideways, gravity itself guiding me back towards the river. Then a figure burst through the woods, large and heavy-set. My father. He stumbled into the middle of the crowd of the dead, waving his arms, trying to seize their attention.
Take me, not them! Take me!
He was screaming like a man possessed, but they didn't even seem to notice him. They were dead set on me, blind to the rest of the world. Then he turned to the lake, and my eyes followed his gaze to the woman from the road. Now her silhouette was standing in the middle of the river, seeming to hover a few inches above the water, her dress billowing in the wind.
Jessica, take me! Tell them to take me!
He let out a primal, raw scream, one that must have torn his throat to shreds.
I don't want to hurt anymore!
She calmly beckoned him with a finger, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He didn't even hesitate. He went sliding down the bank, and for a moment, he seemed to stand upon those bubbling, surging waters just like she did. His arms were stretched wide as he stumbled forward, as if ready to embrace her. Then I blinked, and they were gone. So too disappeared that legion of the dead. It seemed like they'd accepted the trade, one soul for another. The gutter always took its due. It would have been easy to tell everyone that my dad had just stumbled stupidly into the gutters during another one of his drunken stupors, but I wanted people to remember his sacrifice. I weaved some tale of me falling in, and him jumping in after me and hoisting me out, even at the cost of his own life. It didn't make a lot of sense, I must admit, and some people even suspected me for a while. But eventually, everybody just accepted the idea of him being a hero in his last moments, getting some redemption in the last. People like when stories get wrapped up in neat little bows. Sometimes I still dream about the two of them, floating in the center of some underwater cave chamber, yet somehow illuminated by moonlight, and by the walls of the chamber, all lined with glowing pinprick white eyes, like stars in the sky. Dead, but not dead. The current still flowing about them, animating them like marionettes, spinning them around each other. My mother in my father's arms like a waltz, the way they were on their wedding day, dancing, dancing on and on forever, before their audience of the dead.